Okay, let's see. Number 16. The wooden flyer. It is either a bird that resembles an airplane or an airplane that never actually flew. That contradiction sits inside a small wooden artifact from Saqqara, found in the tomb of Padi-Imen and commonly dated to the Ptolemaic period. The object seems easy to explain. It is carved from sycamore wood. It was catalogued with other bird figures. No engine, no moving parts, no hidden mechanism. Yet the shape keeps provoking the same reaction. Straight wings, a streamlined body, a vertical tail, no obvious legs. In 1969, one observer looked at those features and claimed ancient Egyptians had built a glider model. Skeptics answered with a direct problem. If this is aviation, it lacks the part that would help keep it stable in the air. So, the Saqqara bird stays in an awkward middle ground, too ordinary to be a machine, too suggestive to dismiss. The larger question starts there. Why does one funerary object keep overriding its own archaeological setting the moment it resembles modern engineering? The artifact became an airplane because one tail was missing. In 1898, at Saqqara, south of Cairo, excavators working in the tomb of Padi-Imen pulled out a wooden figure only a few inches long and gave it the most ordinary label they had, a bird. It went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, eventually associated with Room 22, and for decades it sat among other carved birds that did not start arguments. This one kept catching the eye. The wings stretched straight out instead of sweeping or curving. The body narrowed like a fuselage. At the rear, instead of a fan of feathers, there was a clean, upright fin. That was enough for Khalil Messiha. In 1969, the Egyptian physician, artist, anatomy professor, and model aircraft enthusiast looked at the object and treated a funerary carving like a design problem. His background mattered. Someone trained to notice structure, balance, and aerodynamic form saw an airframe. Messiha argued that the Saqqara bird might be a glider model, and that one critical component was gone, a horizontal tailplane once attached at the back. That proposal opened the entire controversy. Add the missing piece, and the object can be imagined as a crude glider. Leave the artifact as it survives, and the flight claim loses the feature it most needs. The pro-glider case spreads easily because the resemblance is immediate. The comparison arrives before the caution does. A flat wing planform, a vertical tail that looks uncannily like a stabilizer, a body that reads as fuselage before it reads as bird. Unlike the giant stone mysteries of Egypt, this one is intimate. You can hold it in one hand. It feels less like a monument than a prototype. That is how a small Ptolemaic wooden object from about 200 BC became an icon of ancient aviation. The tomb did not yield engines, blueprints, or workshop debris. The claim grew because a museum bird looked modern to a modern eye, and because once that resemblance takes hold, the missing engineering detail gets mentally supplied by the viewer. The evidence on the other side is just as physical. The artifact was catalogued as a bird because it came from a funerary context full of symbolic objects, and Egyptian bird imagery was everywhere. Sacred birds, protective birds, soul birds, decorative birds. Saqqara is one of the great necropolises of ancient Egypt, a burial ground tied to Memphis over centuries. In 1898, when an excavator found a carved wooden bird in a tomb, reading it as a bird followed directly from where it was found and what surrounded it. Then came the aerodynamic tests. If the Saqqara bird really encodes practical flight, it has to survive contact with airflow, not just analogy. Model builders tried exactly that. Martin Gregory built replicas and examined what happens when you stop admiring the silhouette and ask it to behave in air. His conclusion was blunt. Without a horizontal stabilizer, the thing does not fly stably. The vertical tail can help with yaw. It does not solve pitch. The feature that makes the artifact look most aircraft-like is not the feature that would keep a glider from nosing over or stalling unpredictably. Some reconstructions solved that by adding the part Messiha proposed. With a horizontal tailplane attached, the model could be made more plausible. That fix is also the trap. No surviving tailplane was found with the original object. No clear attachment hardware survives to prove one existed. No associated fragment turned up in the tomb assemblage. The artifact can be improved into a flyer only by supplying the piece the evidence does not supply. And that missing piece changes more than one museum label. It shows how ambiguity hardens into pseudo-history. A single absent component becomes an invitation. If viewers are willing to complete the design in their heads, resemblance can overpower provenance, context, and the ordinary logic of a burial object. The risk is not just getting one artifact wrong. It is learning to trust visual familiarity over archaeological evidence whenever the past happens to echo modern technology. This is where the larger Egyptian pattern begins. The object is real, the craftsmanship is real, the precision of the shape is real. But the leap from engineered-looking to advanced machine survives only when the gaps are filled by imagination rather than by finds. With the Saqqara Bird, the unresolved question is sharper than a simple debunking. The artifact itself refuses to provide the one part that would settle the aviation claim. Yet modern viewers keep providing it for the artifact. The tail is still missing. The stronger mystery is why we are so ready to finish the machine the tomb never actually gave us. Number 15. The temple bulb. Why are there temple chambers where torches should have blackened the ceiling, yet the stone looks clean? That question carried the Dendera relief out of Egyptology and into modern myth. Start with missing soot, and the wall stops looking like a hymn. It starts looking like hardware. In the southern crypts beneath the Hathor temple at Dendera, a priest once had to duck into a space built for objects most visitors would never see. Upper Egypt, a hidden room under a temple raised mainly in the Ptolemaic period and expanded under Rome, on a sacred site far older than the standing walls. The chamber is tight, dark, restricted, not a public hall, not a grand processional court, a storage and ritual zone for divine equipment, images, and cult emblems. On one wall, cut into stone, is the image that launched 1,000 documentaries, an elongated oval, a serpent inside it, a lotus opening at one end, a jed pillar beneath, human figures kneeling, supporting the whole composition as if something heavy or holy is being presented. Seen quickly, it is unnerving. The oval resembles a glass tube. The snake resembles a filament or an electrical discharge. The jed resembles an insulator. The room is underground. The walls are clean. From there, the claim almost writes itself. The Egyptians had light that was not fire. That reading feels modern. The image entered scholarship long before it entered fringe history. Between 1870 and 1875, Auguste Mariette's expedition published the reliefs of Dendera in the massive volumes of Dendera, fixing these crypt scenes on paper in exacting 19th century record. The wall was real. The carving was real. The secrecy of the space was real. But the light bulb came later, when modern viewers met an ancient form that happened to resemble a familiar machine. This is the image sometimes sold as the light bulb that was never meant to light a room. The strongest version of the claim usually leans on eyesight. Look at it, people say. The resemblance is obvious. A tube, a wire, a socket, a support. That kind of testimony has a problem. Egyptian temples are covered in things that only become clear when the captions are read. Dendera is one of the richest examples. This is the same temple complex that gave the world the famous Dendera Zodiac, discovered during Napoleon's campaign on January 24, 1799, and later carried to the Louvre. Dendera has always had a way of becoming modern before it is fully understood. The crypt relief does not stand alone, and that matters. Similar scenes repeat the same serpent from lotus imagery, not once, not as a lone schematic hidden by initiates. It appears as repeated temple iconography, repeated religious language. The accompanying inscriptions point not to current, voltage, or crafted devices, but to Harsamtis, a child form of a solar deity associated with Hathor and Horus, emerging as a serpent from a lotus. In the text, the oval is not a glass envelope. The scene is tied to birth, emergence, sacred manifestation. The room shifts when the symbols are allowed to stay Egyptian. The lotus is not decorative filler. It is the place of emergence. The serpent is not a wire. It is the god's form. The jed is not a ceramic base. It is a sign of stability with a deep religious life of its own. The whole image belongs to temple ritual. where sacred boats, divine appearances, and coded cosmology were carved into walls that were never meant to read like plain illustrations. The crypt is still strange, just in a harder way. The electrical theory fails on the inscriptions, but the crypt context still needs explaining. Why place this specialized form here, in a hidden chamber, instead of only in visible ritual spaces? Egyptology gives an answer broad enough to be solid, and narrow enough to feel unsatisfying. These crypts were restricted cult spaces, storage zones for divine objects, places where ritual images could be more esoteric than anything in the open halls above. The secret technology part collapses. The secret part does not. It was hidden, just not for the reason the modern myth wants. That returns us to the soot. The clean stone argument sounds devastating, only if the relief is supposed to solve the practical lighting of temple interiors. It does not. It never claims to. It is not an instruction panel for electricians trapped in a basement with no torches. The absence or presence of soot belongs to one problem: how Egyptians lit enclosed spaces while decorating, storing, or performing rites in them. The relief belongs to another: what sacred image the priests chose to carve in that darkness. Officially, the wall is a ritual image of Harsamtis emerging from the lotus in a crypt of the Hathor temple at Dendera. In practice, the famous bulb was created by modern pattern matching. A 19th century published relief, a restricted underground room, no engineering text, repeated religious motifs, and a lighting question the relief was never meant to answer. Number 14. The stone glue. The ancient compound hiding between the blocks. In 1984, Robert Wenke and Mark Lehner moved across the Giza monuments with cameras, scales, notebooks, sample bags, and pre-printed forms, hunting something smaller than a fingernail. Not gold, not inscriptions, tiny black flecks caught in mortar. It starts with one joint, a thin seam between two limestone blocks in the Great Pyramid. The stone itself cannot be radiocarbon dated. The seam sometimes traps charcoal, reed, or wood ash from fires used to prepare the building compound. So the registry begins there: location, surface, condition, bag number, sample number, monument. 76 samples were collected in that 1984 campaign across Old and Middle Kingdom monuments. Later, in 1995, Wenke returned with John Nolan, Mark Lehner, and Herbert Haas for a second round. From the Great Pyramid alone, 46 mortar samples were ultimately selected as original structural material rather than later contamination. The material between many of those stones was gypsum-based mortar. That matters. Gypsum is not some futuristic binder dropped into the pyramid by a vanished genius race. It is a workable compound known in Egyptian construction. In the Great Pyramid complex, it sits where masonry needs bedding, packing, and adjustment. The seam is doing something else too. It is carrying time. Then the arithmetic turns strange. The organic bits inside the mortar were tested, and many dates broadly match the Old Kingdom. Good. Khufu stays on the board. But some of the numbers drifted older than the king they were supposed to belong to. In the 1984 set, the average offset came out about 374 years earlier than the standard historical dates used from king lists and chronology. In the 1995 campaign, Old Kingdom pyramid samples were typically 100 to 200 years older. For the Great Pyramid mortar inclusions, published calibrated ranges could run as early as 2871 to 2604 BC. If you want a miracle machine, that sounds exciting for about 10 seconds. Older dates can be waved around as proof that the pyramid is far older than Khufu, and therefore impossible, and therefore whatever theory someone brought with them. But the numbers do not act like a revelation. They act like a construction site. Radiocarbon dating does not date the stone. It does not even date the mortar as one neat chemical event. It dates the organic material trapped inside it, especially charcoal. Charcoal has a life before it becomes a sample. A branch can die decades before it is burned. A beam can be reused. Dead wood can lie dry for generations. In a landscape with limited timber, builders do not burn fresh-cut trees just to help archaeologists 4,500 years later. They burn what they have. Now that narrow seam between the blocks opens into a supply problem. By Khufu's time, pyramid building was consuming fuel on a massive scale. Baking gypsum, cooking food, firing work areas, supporting crews, moving material through an enormous state project. Wood in Egypt was never abundant, and large projects put pressure on it fast. The old wood problem is not an excuse pasted onto bad data. It may be direct evidence of how builders actually fed the fires. You can feel that shift in the paperwork. A black fleck in a labeled bag is not just a date. It may be scrap timber, old brush, reused fuel, maybe deadwood gathered long after it stopped being alive, but long before it entered the mortar. So the lab result can predate the wall that sealed it in. The date is real. The event it measures is earlier than the masonry event you care about. That makes the mortar more important than the fantasy ever was. It does not reveal one impossible substance that held the pyramid together like industrial cement. The gypsum mortar was never the secret superglue of Giza. In many places, the blocks are so massive that the compound functions more as bedding and packing than adhesive in the modern sense. But because it trapped organics, it became one of the few places where the pyramid could answer with numbers at all. And the answer was awkward in exactly the right way. Broadly, Old Kingdom. Consistent with Khufu-era construction, scattered enough to force caution, specific enough to kill the lazy version of the mystery. This is what a real technological civilization looks like up close. Not one lost device, but workers, fuel, reuse, material choices, and records messy enough to leave fingerprints. There is still room inside the scatter. Some variation could reflect reused fuel. Some could come from different building episodes, repairs, or slightly different moments in a long construction process. But the main effect is simpler than that. The seam looks older because the fire was older. So that thin joint between two stones finally gives up what it was hiding. Not alien mortar. Not proof the Great Pyramid belongs to some vanished age before Egyptian history. A pinch of charcoal and gypsum, logged in 1984 and again in 1995, telling you that Khufu's builders may have been burning old wood in a country already short on trees. At Giza, the line between two blocks is pale, brittle, and almost invisible until the light drops. Number 13. The Blue Furnace. Around 1910, workmen entering Tomb B3 at Mayer did not find a machine, a weapon, or a royal treasure. They found a small river animal, only 20 centimeters long, glowing with a blue so clean it still looks wet. Black lotus flowers run across its back and flanks. Its smile is almost comic. Its surface is not. The color hits first. 4,000 years later, it still looks like enamel under fresh light. But this little hippopotamus was buried around 1961 to 1878 BCE in the Middle Kingdom, in the funerary context of the nomarch Senbi II and a shaft burial for the steward Senbi. By the time most people meet him, he already has a nickname, William. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, accession number September 1st, 17. Gift of Edward S. Harkness, 1917. A family joke passed into print in 1931 through Punch. The museum repeated it until a funerary object became a celebrity. The joke makes him gentler than he was meant to be. In ancient Egypt, a hippopotamus belonged to the Nile marsh. Reeds, lotus, rebirth. It also belonged to violence. A hippo could smash a boat, crush a body, and turn calm water into panic in one charge. So this object carries both ideas at once. Flowers cover the body, but the animal itself is dangerous. That is why the broken legs matter. William's legs were found damaged and later restored. The common reading is brutally practical. Disable the hippo before burial, so it can offer life-giving symbolism without stomping through the afterlife causing trouble. Cute in the gallery, dangerous in the tomb. The exact moment of that damage is harder to prove from the object alone. Some breakage could be ancient ritual. Some could come from burial pressure, excavation, or handling, but the act still fits the nature of the animal. The figurine would be memorable for that alone. But in a story about impossible-looking Egyptian technology, the real focus is the skin. This is not carved turquoise, not painted clay, not ordinary pottery. Egyptian faience is a non-clay ceramic. It starts with crushed quartz, then goes through heat until the outside becomes a bright, glassy coat. The result looks so modern that people keep reaching for the wrong category. they think of porcelain, or a later kind of glaze, or some lost synthetic trick. What they are seeing is a controlled surface process old enough to sit in a Middle Kingdom tomb. Look closely, and the body separates into layers. Inside is a pale quartz-based core. Outside is a blue-green shell with a slight shine. It is thin but decisive, as if the color bloomed out of the object instead of being painted onto it. That is what makes William feel advanced, in the unsettling way Egypt often does. No alien machine is hiding here. A civilization learned how to make surfaces behave. The dimensions are small enough to miss if you rush past them. 7 7/8 inches long, 2 15/16 wide, 4 7/16 high. Roughly 20 by 7.5 by 11.2 centimeters. The scale is part of the trick. Monumental technology announces itself. This does the opposite. It sits in your hand. A furnace, crushed silica, alkaline fluxes, copper compounds, and enough control to take a marsh animal from the color of desert stone to condensed river water. That color was not incidental decoration. Egyptian blue-green carried the Nile with it. Vegetation, freshness, renewal. The black marsh plants complete the image, turning the animal into a portable wetland for the dead. But the brilliance of the blue is what pushes the object past expectation. Bright surfaces usually fade first. Burial strips paint. Time dulls almost everything. William still reads from across the room. That endurance can feel like magic, a lucky accident preserved by a tomb. It was not. Faience production could use more than one glazing method, but the result depended on repeatable ingredients and repeatable heat. Silica for the body, alkali lime glaze chemistry to help the surface vitrify, copper as the colorant, then firing conditions narrow enough to bring out that blue-green instead of killing it. With less control, there is no William. There is a chalky failure, a different hue, a dead surface. So the mascot in the glass case is evidence from a furnace. The brightness is not a mystery. It is a manufacturing outcome. Crushed quartz packed into shape. Alkaline compounds moving toward the surface. Copper feeding the color. Heat locking the skin into place. Around 4,000 years later, the legs can still be debated. The nickname can still distract. The blue cannot. Copper in a silica-rich glaze, fired under controlled conditions. Number 12. The walking toe. In 1997, an eluded shaft tomb cut into the floor of chapel TT95A at Sheikh Abd el-Korna, researchers examining a disturbed female mummy found a very small mystery: a toe. Not a carved token beside the body, not a funerary spare part set nearby for the afterlife. A wooden right big toe, still attached where the living one had once been. At first it sounds cosmetic. Ancient Egypt cared deeply about bodily completeness in death, so an artificial toe in a burial would not be surprising by itself. But this object does not stay in that category. It was made from 4 shaped parts: the toe itself, a dorsal plate over the top of the foot, a triangular side flap, and a textile strap to hold it in place. Those are not the choices of someone filling a visual gap in a wrapped corpse. They are the choices of someone trying to keep a device attached to a moving body. Here, the missing body part mattered more than the wood. It was the hallux, the big toe, on the right foot. That toe helps stabilize you and push you forward when you walk. Lose it, and the problem is not appearance, it is every step after that. Sandal on stone, weight shifting, skin rubbing, balance changing by degrees until those degrees turn into pain. That is where the question starts, in a tomb on the West Bank near Luxor, about 3,000 years ago. Was this made to complete a dead woman, or to help a living one keep walking? The burial itself does not make the answer easy. TT95A had originally been built back in the 15th century BC, but the woman with the prosthesis was buried much later. By the time modern researchers reached her, the shaft had been looted and the remains were mixed. There was no untouched scene, no inscription explaining the case, just fragments, and one intensely personal object still sitting where a foot meets the world. This may be a replacement body part that actually worked. What makes it extraordinary is not exotic material. It is wood, textile, leather in some descriptions, ordinary stuff by Egyptian standards. But ordinary materials can do remarkable things when the fit is right. This device had to match one woman's anatomy closely enough not to bite into the skin, twist off, or fail under repeated loading. It had to fit the stump, clear the neighboring toes, sit inside a sandal, and survive the moment when the foot rolls forward and the missing big toe would normally take over. That is much harder than making something look convincing in a burial. Later analysis pushed the case further. Radiology and close study of the toe showed shaping and wear consistent with use, not just display. The surfaces were not pristine. They carried the marks of contact, adjustment, and repetition. A craftsman had not simply carved an elegant answer to a religious requirement. Someone had refined a practical fit. The design keeps revealing what mattered. The dorsal plate spreads pressure across the top of the foot. The side flap helps stabilize the prosthesis laterally. The strap is not decorative. It is an anchoring system. The whole object reflects a blunt fact about the body. If a medical device hurts, people stop using it. By the time researchers connected with the University of Manchester began biomechanical testing, the question had become sharper. Not whether ancient Egyptians could imagine an artificial toe. They could. The real test was whether this one restored enough function to matter. In 2012, a study in the Journal of Prosthetics and Orthotics tested replicas of Egyptian artificial toes, with volunteers missing a right big toe. They wore them with sandals. They walked. The point was not theater. It was gait, push-off, stability, and comfort under realistic conditions. The results were bad news for anyone who wants ancient objects to remain purely symbolic. At least one reconstructed Egyptian toe showed that a user could walk effectively in it. Not perfectly, not like modern carbon fiber, but effectively enough to blur the line between ritual object and medical technology. The wear marks had been pointing there all along. This thing was not meant only to be seen. It was meant to survive contact with the ground. If the biggest Egyptian mysteries are not alien machines, then this is the kind of civilization that made them seem possible anyway. A state powerful enough to raise monuments, craftsmen skilled enough to solve the biomechanics of a foot with wood, strap tension, and anatomical judgment. No lost super device, just repeatable skill applied so closely to the body that 3 millennia later you can still read the problem it was built to solve. The burial context will never let the case close completely. A disturbed tomb always leaves room for caution. The prosthesis may have served in life and remained necessary in death, but the object itself keeps leaning in one direction. The fit, the fastening, the wear, the sandal logic, the walking tests. The answer is quiet but clear. This was almost certainly not a fake toe made for a mummy. It was a working toe that followed its owner into the grave. Somewhere in Thebes, around 1000 BC, a woman stood up, shifted her weight forward, and felt wood take over where bone no longer could. Number 11. The Trauma Manual. The medical text sounds less like magic than a battlefield report. In 1862, in Luxor, the American dealer Edwin Smith bought a damaged papyrus roll that did not look like a wonder. No gold leaf, no painted gods, just a long, battered manuscript in black and red ink, copied around the 17th century BCE and broken at both ends. It mattered for the same reason the working prosthetic toe mattered. It belonged to use, to hands, to pain, to bodies that had to keep going. One line in that text lands like a verdict, a head wound, a skull broken open. The examiner studies the injury and gives the patient a category, an ailment not to be treated. It sounds brutal until the document shows you what it is. After Smith's death, the papyrus passed to the New York Historical Society and then to the New York Academy of Medicine. In 1930, James Henry Breasted published it in 2 volumes, recovering the scale of a technical tradition that had been almost invisible inside the modern image of Egypt. What emerged was not a spell book with a few practical notes mixed in. It was almost the reverse. Case after case, arranged like reports. Head injuries first, then neck, spine, chest. A wound is inspected. The patient is questioned. Symptoms are tested. The diagnosis is named. The prognosis is judged. Treatment is prescribed. If the biggest Egyptian riddles were not alien machines, this is the kind of civilization that made them look impossible anyway. one that turned observation into a tool. You can hear it in the cadence. The text does not drift, it advances. If a man has a gash in the skull, the examiner places his hand on it. If the bone is smashed, he notes how it feels. If the patient cannot look at his shoulders or chest, that matters. If the neck is stiff, that matters. If fluid comes from the nose or ears, that matters. Each case moves with the cold rhythm of triage, as if someone had seen these injuries often enough to stop describing them poetically. Then the papyrus does something almost unnervingly modern. In one skull injury, the ancient examiner describes the surface of the brain itself, the membranes, the fluid, even pulsation. This text contains the earliest known written example of the word brain. And in the small surviving body of ancient Egyptian writing where that word appears, 6 of its 8 known uses are in this papyrus. That detail shifts the temperature of the whole manuscript. You are no longer reading vague folklore with a few lucky guesses. You are watching somebody look, compare, sort, and decide. The surviving copy is usually dated around 1600 BCE, but many scholars think it preserves far older material, in some arguments reaching back toward 3000 BCE. The chain of copying is unresolved. The method is not. Long before Hippocratic medicine became famous, someone had built a repeatable way to handle trauma. The most revealing entries are not always the ones that offer a cure. They are the ones that refuse one. The papyrus sorts cases into outcomes. Some injuries are favorable, some are uncertain, some are declared untreatable. That is not just an intellectual distinction. In a workshop, a quarry, a military camp, or a construction site, the label could decide everything that followed. A man judged treatable might be bandaged, immobilized, fed, and watched. A man judged uncertain might consume days of labor and materials, while everyone waited to see which way he turned. A man judged beyond help could be set aside, mourned, or simply counted as lost to the system. Misclassification was not abstract. It could mean the difference between intervention and abandonment, between recovery and being sent back to labor too soon, between a salvageable patient and a dead one. Picture the scene behind it. A man is brought in after a fall from scaffolding. The examiner feels the wound, questions him, checks whether he can turn his neck, whether his limbs answer, whether fluid escapes the ears. If the findings fit a manageable injury, the response is immediate. Dressings, restraints, a plan. Now shift scenes. A soldier arrives after a crushing blow to the head. He cannot focus his eyes. His neck is rigid. The skull is depressed beneath the hand. The classification changes, and with it, the man's fate. The text is practical, but practicality here is not neutral. It distributes scarce attention. That is why the phrase, "an ailment not to be treated," matters so much. It marks the line where knowledge becomes administration. Egyptian medicine as a whole included ritual and incantation. This papyrus does not erase that world. But this document cuts out a specialized trauma tradition from inside it, probably shaped by accidents, warfare, and long familiarity with damaged bodies. A split scalp is not a theology problem when blood is in your eyes. It is a test of whether the examiner can read signs quickly enough to matter. This damaged roll from Luxor belongs in the same story as monuments, instruments, and engineered stone. Egypt's advantage was not only what it could build, it was what it could standardize, measure, record, and repeat. The papyrus suggests institutions behind the cases, places where injured workers or soldiers appeared often enough for patterns to harden into protocol, and where someone believed those protocols were worth copying for the future. If one such manual survived by accident, damaged and incomplete, it raises a larger possibility. How many other technical texts once existed beside it? Guides for fractures, tools, transport, surgery, recovery, used until they wore out and vanished. The surviving line is final, but it opens onto a bigger system, a civilization where method had already begun deciding who could be saved and who would be left behind. Number 10. The leaking clock. What if the hardest part of building a clock is not making time flow, but making crooked time look regular? In 1904, Inside the temple complex of Karnak at Thebes, archaeologists pulled out a broken alabaster vessel that did not look like a machine at all. It looked ceremonial, heavy, carved, the sort of object you would place in a sanctuary, not on a workbench. After the fragments were reassembled, Cairo catalogued it as JE 37525, and the object changed category. It was a clock from the reign of Amenhotep III, around the 14th century BCE. Its inner walls carried marks that made almost no sense at first glance. The clock had to make uneven hours feel exact. A sundial dies at sunset. Karnak did not. Priests still had to perform night rituals, observe stars, and break darkness into ordered pieces. The temple needed an instrument that could work when the sky went black. This vessel did it with a hole near the bottom. Fill it with water. Let the water drain. Watch the level drop. Read the passing hours from scales cut into the interior. That sounds simple. The complication is in those interior scales. There is not one clean set of hour lines. There are multiple calibrated columns tied to the months. Put yourself inside the problem they were solving. Egyptian hours were not fixed modern hours. Night was divided into 12 parts, but winter nights are longer than summer nights. Each hour of darkness stretched and shrank across the year. The clock still had to count 12 night hours, while the night itself kept changing length. That is the puzzle hidden inside the stone. If the most famous Egyptian mysteries are not alien machines, this is the kind of civilization that can still look impossible anyway, one that turns a leaking bowl into seasonal mathematics. The vessel belongs to Amenhotep III, who ruled roughly from 1391 to 1353 BCE, but the idea itself may be older. An official named Amenemhet, early in the 18th dynasty, claimed in his tomb inscription to have invented a water clock. Whether that was bragging, office politics, or memory of a genuine innovation, the Karnak clepsydra is the oldest surviving physical example. Not the first clock in theory, the first one still sitting in front of us in stone. The outside does something strange. Instead of leaving the shell plain, its makers covered it with astronomical and protective imagery. Constellations, planets, deities, beings that belong as much to ritual as to measurement. In a modern museum, that can look like ornament wrapped around a device. At Karnak, it was one program. Timekeeping was not separated from theology by a glass case and a label. The same object helped organize ceremonies, structure the night, and map sacred order onto the sky above Thebes. Start with the physical logic. Water pressure changes as the vessel empties. A high water level pushes harder than a low one, so the flow is not perfectly uniform from start to finish. A water clock is already a small engineering headache before seasons even enter the room. Then add the Egyptian system of unequal night hours. Then require the instrument to serve a temple schedule, not a philosopher's toy. What you get is not just water dripping down. It is a vessel calibrated against a year that refuses to hold still. That is why the marks inside matter so much. There are 12 monthly scales. Not one universal grid pretending every night is the same, but a set of adjustments that admits it is not. The makers knew the problem. They cut the solution into the bowl. How accurate was it in actual use? That part is still unsettled. Scholars can see the logic of the calibration, but real performance is harder to pin down, because the speed of outflow changes as the head of water drops. A clock can be conceptually brilliant and still drift in practice. The priests at Karnak may have used it as a working instrument, a ritual reference, or both, checked against stellar observations when precision mattered most. So the object sits in that very Egyptian zone where observation, administration, and ceremony overlap instead of separating cleanly. That overlap is what makes it advanced, not hidden gears, not lost electricity, a temple problem, defined precisely enough that stonecutters and timekeepers could build around it. They were trying to make 12 hours remain 12 hours, even when the night itself would not cooperate. So those lines inside the alabaster vessel were not flourishes added to impress a king or fill empty space on a luxury object. They were there because a summer night and a winter night are different lengths, but the official ritual still demanded 12 divisions either way. On the outside, the clock declares cosmic order with stars and protective figures. On the inside, it wrestles with leaking water, changing pressure, and uneven darkness. Number 9. The star plum. After sunset, the problem changes. In daylight, a shadow gives you a line. In darkness, the line disappears. Picture a builder in Egypt with a foundation to set, walls to square, and a ritual hour to hit exactly, but no sun left to work with. The horizon has gone black. He still has to find north. If he misses it by enough, the consequence is not abstract. A ceremony begins at the wrong hour. A temple axis drifts off the intended celestial target, and an error laid out in darkness hardens into stone by morning. Around 600 BCE, in Edfu in Upper Egypt, an astronomer priest named Bes, son of Concertus, owned an instrument so plain it almost feels like a joke. Bronze, a straight bar, a narrow sighting slot, a hanging plumb line. The inscription was inlaid in electrum. On the museum piece, the string and bob are modern replacements. The original organic parts are gone. That missing cord matters. The object in the case is only the durable skeleton of a working tool. In use, every accurate sighting depended on the vanished parts hanging true in the night air. Bes was not collecting curiosities. He was attached to Horus of Edfu. His nights were scheduled. Rituals had to begin at the proper hour. Darkness had to be divided. Sacred space had to match the sky. The same problem runs through Egyptian engineering from Giza onward. If this civilization was not hiding miracle machines, how did it keep producing results that still look impossible from a distance? Part of the answer sits in systems built from repeated observation. The hand matters. The records matter. A water clock can leak. A star cannot. When precision mattered most, the sky became the reference, but only if the observer knew how to read it without rushing the moment. This handheld tool turned stars into survey marks. The maquette makes sense when you stop looking for a lone gadget and start seeing a procedure. An observer sets up a north-south line, often with a second sighting aid. Then he watches selected stars move, not randomly. He waits for a known star to cross the meridian, that north-south line through the sky. At the exact moment the star aligns with the vertical plumb line, the instrument gives him what a mechanical clock gives us now, the position of the night. The motion doing the work is simple. Gravity pulls the line straight down. Earth's rotation carries the star across the field of view. The priest handles the difficult part. He has to know which star to watch and when. Bronze, string, eyesight, memory, and star tables. Together, they could establish direction and divide darkness into hours. But this is where the risk sharpens. Choose the wrong star, observe at the wrong season, or call the transit a little too early, and the mistake is no longer a tiny astronomical slip. It becomes a shifted line on the ground, a doorway aimed wrong, a rite mistimed in a temple that claims to mirror cosmic order. Egyptian astronomy had the paperwork to support this pressure. The diagonal star tables are among the earliest astronomical documents from ancient Egypt. They survive as evidence that nobody was just glancing upward and making a lucky guess while a crew waited for instructions. There were named stars, ordered observations, recurring hours. Egypt was already comfortable running a 365-day civil calendar, which meant the state had practiced turning celestial regularity into schedules that people were expected to obey. Daytime had its own portable devices, though surviving examples are rare enough that one Ptolemaic shadow clock fragment in the Met is described as one of only a handful known. That rarity matters because it reminds us how incomplete the physical record is. Night required a different method, so the sky itself became the dial when material instruments were scarce, fragile, or lost. You can feel the sophistication in the operator's routine. He fixes the sight, waits through the dark, keeps the plumb line still, and does not get to average the result later if the ceremony is about to begin before dawn. A bronze bar in a case looks primitive. A trained temple astronomer under a clear Edfu sky, following a calibrated procedure, looks uncomfortably modern. He is using repeated stellar motion as a working reference. Orientation, timing, verification. Egyptian precision makes more sense when you stop searching for a lost master machine and start noticing chains of repeatable methods. The water clock handled one part of the night, but water drifts. The Merkhet answered with something steadier. If a builder needed architecture tied to the heavens after sunset, this was one of the most grounded solutions Egypt produced. There is still one catch. The surviving Merkhet in London dates to about 600 BCE. That is late if you are thinking about pyramids and Old Kingdom alignments. The artifact does not prove that this exact bronze object type was in a surveyor's hand 2,000 years earlier. That gap matters because it is exactly where bad explanations rush in. If we use a late surviving object too casually, we risk smoothing over real changes in practice and claiming direct proof where we only have analogy. What it does prove is that by the first millennium BCE, Egypt still maintained a priestly observational technology capable of turning celestial transit into usable time and direction. The practice may preserve much older traditions. The material evidence still cannot close that full timeline, and that unresolved gap is the point moving forward. It is one thing to catch a star on a plumb line and recover north in ritual darkness, and another to carry that same sky-based precision onto a building site where a single mistaken line can govern tons of stone. Number 8. The mining map. Around 1150 BC, during the short reign of Ramses IV, a royal expedition left the Nile Valley and entered Wadi Hammamat, the hard stone corridor between the river and the Red Sea. The paperwork behind it reads cold: stone for statues, route through the eastern desert, men sent out, resources to be found and moved. Somewhere inside that operation, probably in the hands of the Deir el-Medina scribe Amenakte son of Ipui, or someone in his circle, a papyrus was drawn. Reconstructed from its fragments, it measures about 41 centimeters wide and roughly 2.10 meters long. Across it run strange patches of red, black, pink, and pale bands. At first glance they look decorative, almost casual, the kind of color a modern viewer files under art before thought catches up. But this sheet was made for use. It shows a real stretch of terrain in central Egypt's eastern desert, about 15 kilometers, around 9 miles, of the Wadi Hammamat system. It traces wadis, hills, side routes, quarry zones, and a settlement tied to gold working near Bir Fawakir. It marks quartz veins. It distinguishes gravels and rock by color and pattern. Stand in that corridor for a moment. No temple court, no painted ceiling, just a dry channel with no river beside you, no farmland, no room for a forgiving mistake. The sun is overhead. The stone the king wants is Bekhen, the dark ornamental rock prized for royal statues. It has to be found, cut, and hauled out through terrain that can kill a convoy simply by being empty. A route alone will not do. A sketch alone will not do. The state needs to know where the stone is, where the gold-bearing quartz runs, where workers can be based, where the side valleys branch, and which ground is worth the labor of crossing. That is what hits when you look at the Turin Papyrus. It behaves like an extraction document. Road, rock, quarry, and mineral zone sit in one working picture. Not a symbolic landscape, not a sacred diagram, an industrial one. The fragments survive by accident. Agents of Bernardino Drovetti acquired them in Egypt around 1820, and they eventually entered what is now the Egyptian Museum in Turin. By then, the original expedition was more than 3,000 years gone. The papyrus had broken apart. Parts had to be reconstructed. What we are looking at is already a damaged survivor of a damaged archive, a narrow strip of an administrative world that mostly vanished because papyrus usually does. Even in pieces, it is unnervingly specific. Modern geologists noticed that immediately. James Harrell and V. Max Brown argued that the map is not just topographical, but geological. It is often described as the oldest surviving geological map in the world, older than the next known example by about 29 centuries. The point is not just age. The drafter was not merely showing where to walk. He was classifying terrain visually, separating exploitable materials from the surrounding ground. The colors are doing work. Even the name most people know can blur the picture. The gold mine papyrus sounds dramatic, but it points too narrowly. Gold is there. The map shows the gold-working settlement at Bir Fawakir and nearby gold-bearing quartz veins. But the Museo Egizio's own presentation says the main royal action behind this document was likely the movement of Bekhen stone for statues under Ramesses IV. Gold is part of the landscape being managed. It is not the whole story. The full picture feels broader and strangely modern. One corridor, multiple resources, one state document trying to make that corridor legible enough to exploit. So the papyrus does something easy to miss if you only hunt for dazzling objects. It turns desert into information. This branch leads there. This zone yields that. This rock differs from that gravel. This settlement sits near this resource. It is bureaucracy under pressure from heat, distance, labor, and royal demand. Strip away the fantasy of alien machines, and this is the kind of civilization left in view, one able to translate a brutal landscape into instructions. Those colored markings that first looked ornamental are the whole point. They carry route, rock, and resource at once. A quarry road, a gold-bearing vein, a classified terrain. The papyrus in Turin is not just a map of the desert. It is a working order written across stone, distance, and need. Number 7. The flood gauge. In late July, long before the Aswan High Dam ended the old flood cycle in 1970, a man on Elephantine Island could walk down a stone stairway and read the next year of Egypt in water. Not poetry, not a vague omen, a line against carved masonry. Too low meant hunger, too high meant destruction. Somewhere between them was survival, and getting that judgment wrong could shake granaries, labor schedules, and faith in the king himself. On the island opposite modern Aswan, near the first cataract, a priest or official went down step by step toward the Nile and stopped where the water met the stone. Here, a staircase turned a river into a government forecast. Start with the count. 52 steps, no tower of gears, no hidden bronze valves. 52 cut stone steps dropping toward the river at one of Egypt's southern gates, where the inundation was thought to enter the country. Elephantine was not some random village landing. It was the capital of the first Upper Egyptian, or Nubian nome, inhabited from at least the early dynastic period onward. The place already carried weight before anyone measured water there. It sat at a frontier of trade, movement, and state control. If you wanted to know what the Nile was about to do to Egypt, this was one of the first places to ask, and one of the most consequential places from which to answer. The geometry is plain. A stairway works because water leaves a mark without argument. It touches one step and not the next. It climbs across one course of stone and stops below another. You do not have to imagine a flood. You count it. That is the method. Elephantine had more than one layer to this. Several Nilometers existed there. One was linked to the sacred lake of the Temple of Khnum. Another stood near the southern tip of the island. The measuring point did not sit outside religion with a neat modern label like science. It sat inside sacred geography. Khnum, the ram god worshipped there, was the lord of the cataract region, tied to the Nile's flow itself. Priests honored the force behind the inundation in the same place where officials measured it. Myth and measurement shared the same address, which meant the reading carried more than practical weight. It could sound like nature, administration, and divine order speaking at once. To modern ears, that can sound less advanced. It was not. The sophistication here was administrative. A natural event entered the system as a reading. Once the reading existed, power could act. Picture flood season, late July or August. The river has started to swell. You stand on the steps. The lower stone is cooler. The water line leaves it damp. Above you are the temple precinct, officials, storage, writing, expectation. Below you runs the current coming north from deep Africa. You look at the river against the graduated stone, and for a moment the whole country shrinks to a height. Then the danger begins. If the level promised a weak inundation, granaries could not wait for certainty. Storage plans had to harden early. Officials could press harder for collection, while villages were already afraid of scarcity. If the level came in strong, the fear changed shape. damaged banks, disrupted fields, repair labor, transport trouble, losses before harvest even began. One reading could send scribes toward different orders, and every order landed on someone's back. One priest on a stairway could not magically see next spring's fields. He could not. And the surviving evidence does not preserve one single formula that converts every elephantine reading into one neat tax rate for every period of Egyptian history. We do not have that clean equation. What we do have is enough. Nile level meant harvest expectations. Harvest expectations meant storage decisions, tax pressure, labor demands, and political confidence. Too little inundation, and fields failed to get enough water and silt. Too much, and the flood destroyed what it was meant to feed. Between those extremes sat the number every administration wanted first, because once it was announced, markets, households, and offices would start behaving as if the future had already arrived. The tool looks simple because it is simple. That is exactly why it matters. A plumb line tells you vertical. A clock tells you time. A map tells you route and resource. A nilometer told a state how worried to become, and how much worry to pass on. Elephantine belongs to a much longer history than the staircase alone suggests. The island's remains span layers of settlement, temple life, storage, administration, and repeated rebuilding. That matters here because the nilometer was not an isolated curiosity dropped into empty space. It functioned inside a place where Egyptians had long practiced governing a border, managing resources, and tying authority to sacred landscape. To flatten Elephantine into a picturesque stair is to miss why a water reading there carried force. Still, the whole mechanism comes back to the smallest possible forensic unit, a level. One height on one day at one southern threshold. Its plainness is almost rude. The harder answer is simpler, a civilization organized enough to make even a river report. The official on the stair was not checking whether the Nile was beautiful. He was checking whether the state would squeeze, save, or brace. The reading did not stay on the stone. It moved outward into grain, expectation, and levy. And that is where the quiet staircase becomes dangerous. A number this powerful did not only measure water. It depended on who read it, who announced it, and who dared challenge it. If the flood mark justified taxation, storage, and royal confidence, then a disputed mark was not a technical error. It was an accusation waiting to spread. Number 6. The engineered oasis. A low Nile can begin as a number cut into stone, but it ends somewhere else entirely. In a field that does not green, in a granary that does not fill, in tax grain that never reaches storage. In a court forced to explain why the flood was measured, yet hunger still arrived. Now picture the reverse. You stand at the edge of the desert and see crops where there should be dust, black soil, reed beds, narrow water channels catching the light. Then you lift your eyes, and the land opens into a basin more than 1,200 square kilometers across, southwest of modern Cairo, with desert pressing in from every side. That scale is not just impressive, it is dangerous. Every extra rise in water has room to spread into marsh. Every misjudged drop can strand whole margins dry, and every embankment or canal has to matter across a landscape too large to command by sight alone. Fertile margins beside emptiness, water beside salt. It looks like a natural oasis. It was not natural in that sense. Around the 19th century BCE, during the reign of Amenemhat III, Egyptian officials faced a problem the nilometer could never solve by itself. The flood could come too high and damage the valley. It could come too low and starve it. Measuring the Nile was not enough. Part of its behavior had to be redirected. West of the main valley, a branch known as the Bahr Yusuf carried water toward the Fayum Depression, a low basin ending in the Great Lake the Greeks would later call Moeris. The basin already existed. The lake already existed. What changed was control. That is the line between a wetland and a machine. Under Amenemhat III, the state appears to have expanded that control across the landscape. Water could be let in near Lahoun. It could spread across fields through canals. It could drain toward the lower lake zone. The goal was timing, not spectacle. Excess floodwater could be slowed or stored instead of hammering the valley all at once. As levels shifted, exposed edges of the basin could become cultivable land. But this was also a royal gamble. If the basin was mishandled, the damage was not abstract. Drowned plots, salted margins, failed harvests, missing tax deliveries, labor obligations that could no longer be met, and a ruler whose promise of order suddenly looked false. A canal cut too shallow, a bank left weak, a release mistimed by days, and stored water could turn from reserve to rot. This is why the place belongs among Egyptian technologies that seem impossible at first glance, an oasis engineered into existence. Its ancient fame almost hid what was actually achieved. More than 1,000 years later, in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus visited Egypt and encountered the region as a viewer would, a vast sheet of water, royal monuments near its edge, and green land pressed up against desert. At Hawara, near the entrance to the basin, stood Amenemhat III's own pyramid complex. Beside it was a mortuary enclosure later remembered by Greek writers as the labyrinth. Its size mattered less than its effect. The visitor sees stone first, authority made visible, while the hydraulic system that made the surrounding fertility possible lies stretched outward in channels, banks, and managed levels across the depression. Kings, monuments, a great lake, reclaimed land. The eye wants one dramatic explanation. The easy conclusion followed. The pharaoh had made a lake. The ground tells a more complicated story. Geological work and sediment studies show that the lake system long predates the Middle Kingdom. The modern remnant, Lake Karun, still sits on the northern edge of the depression, now saline to hypersaline, a surviving piece of what was once a much larger wetland lake system. The pharaoh did not conjure water out of bare rock. He inherited a natural trap. The harder achievement was less dramatic and easier to miss, regulating a living basin whose levels changed with flood, season, silt, and terrain. The scale of that skill becomes clear when you picture the alternative. Overfeed the basin, and fields drown. Fail to spread the water, and the margins stay useless. Fail to draw off the excess, and the whole system backs up into marsh. Let silt thicken in the wrong place, and a channel that fed one district begins starving another. Mistime the flood, and the same water that saves one season ruins the next. On a basin this large, failure does not stay local for long. It moves outward into hunger, arrears, forced labor shortages, and the political fact that kingship in Egypt was judged by whether order reached the fields. At Hawara, that control stood beside royal stone. Amenemhat III placed his pyramid and mortuary complex at the threshold of the basin, close to the point where management of water and management of kingship met. That placement was not decorative. It was administrative theater, backed by real hydraulics. A ruler tied his name to fields that appeared where flood and desert had once met badly. Official memory could compress the whole thing into a simpler claim. The king made the lake. In practice, the system was messier and more impressive. A natural depression, fed irregularly by the Bahr Yusuf, became regulated infrastructure. Nile water was diverted near Lahoun, distributed across the basin in canals, and finally drawn down toward Lake Moeris. You can imagine the whole arrangement working only as long as each part keeps faith with the others. Intake, spread, retention, release. Later writers saw a single artificial marvel. What actually stood there was a managed water balance spread across an entire landscape. And the moment that balance slipped, miracle would turn back into marsh, salt, and blame. Number 5. The Broken Giant. You are standing in the granite quarries just south of Aswan. The stone under your feet is pink, hot, and scored with shallow rounded troughs. They run beside a shape too large to read at once. Then your eyes adjust. It is an obelisk, or rather, the beginning of one. 41.7 meters long, 4.2 meters across at its widest point, still lying where it was born, still fused to the quarry floor by a strip of bedrock that was never fully cut away. And near its body, a crack. During the reign of Hatshepsut, sometime between 1473 and 1458 BC, Egyptian quarrymen began shaping what may have been the largest obelisk they ever attempted. If they had finished it, it would have weighed more than 1,000 tons and stood about 1/3 larger than any surviving ancient Egyptian obelisk. But Aswan does not show you a finished monument. It shows you work interrupted, the instant before a mountain became a needle. Most Egyptian mysteries reach us polished, upright, inscribed. The labor is gone from sight. Here, the work stopped too early for that. The quarry kept the evidence. The workers did not carve a pillar somewhere else and drag it in. They chose a massive swell of granite, still locked into the living rock. They marked the outline directly on the bedrock. Then they cut trenches around it, lowering the surrounding stone until the future obelisk emerged from the quarry floor like a ship in a dry dock. Thousands of dolerite pounders have been found in the Aswan quarries. These dark, hard stone balls were used to batter granite again and again until it bruised, fractured, and powdered away. Up close, the marks they left are the strange part. They are not clean saw lines. They are scooped hollows, repeating curves, shallow bites eaten into the granite surface. To modern eyes, they can look almost machine-made. Failure preserved the rough stage that finished monuments erase. You are seeing the work before smoothing, before polishing, before transport hid the method behind the result. Then comes the next physical problem. The sides had to be cut deeper. The underside had to be freed without splitting the body. After that, a block weighing over 1,000 tons had to be extracted from the pit, brought to the Nile, loaded for transport, floated north, and raised upright at a temple site, likely in Thebes. The quarry was not an isolated scar in the desert. Remains of a harbor had been found near the site. This was part of a chain: quarry, river, barge, temple. If one link failed, the whole plan failed with it. Granite did not care about royal ambition. Somewhere during that cutting, a fracture opened in the stone. The giant was damaged before the most dangerous stage even began. That is the image at Aswan. Not triumph. Not a public collapse. A decision. Stop. Leave it where it lies. Walk away from weeks or months of labor because one flaw running through 41.7 meters of stone could turn a monument into debris. In 1922, Reginald Engelbach published one of the early archaeological studies of the site, trying to read the quarry itself as a technical document. That is exactly what it is. Not a legend, not a vanished machine, a work site, a frozen industrial problem in granite. By 1979, the area was folded into the UNESCO listing for the Nubian monuments, but the essential fact was visible long before any designation. The place explains itself in negatives. Here is what had been cut. Here is what remained attached. Here is where the operation failed. You can feel how close they were. The long body is already there. The taper is already implied. The trenches already isolate most of the mass from the surrounding bedrock. But the final secret is hidden under the stone. No abandoned tool mark fully answers it. How exactly they plan to separate that underside safely, lift the monolith free, and move it intact is still reconstructed from fragments and from later success, not from this one unfinished attempt. The quarry proves they could shape granite on an immense scale. It does not give us the whole extraction in one neat diagram. The crack does two things at once. It ends the monument. It opens the evidence. Finished obelisks speak clearly about power. This one speaks about process. Because it broke before polish, before transport, before inscription, the rounded pounder marks survived. The trenches survived. The half-freed underside survived. Its abandonment preserved the most revealing stage of all. The moment Egyptian technology is still visible as labor, geometry, and risk, not yet disguised as perfection. By sunset, the quarry goes quiet. The giant is still there, still attached, still cracked. The flaw that killed the monument is the reason its making never disappeared. Number 4. The cut granite. In the winter of 1881, inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, Flinders Petrie walked up to a granite box most visitors treat as a symbol and treated it like shop debris. It was empty. The lid was gone. The red Aswan granite sat scarred near the west side of the room. On the inside wall, Petrie noticed a stubborn little detail, a circular trace where a drill had bitten into stone and stopped. The granite cuts looked like they came from a machine shop. By 1883, when Petrie published The Pyramids and Temples of Gizeh, he was describing the coffer in the language of mechanics, not mystery. He noted traces of 2 drill holes inside it, not decoration, not ritual imagery. Repetitive cutting action in one of the hardest stones the Egyptians worked. the argument shifts right there. The object in front of you stops being only Khufu's sarcophagus. It also becomes evidence in a fight over what kind of civilization could make familiar tools produce unfamiliar results. The machine claim is easy to state. Granite is hard, copper is soft. So the Egyptians must have had something better. Steel, electricity, high-speed rotary drills, some lost device that turns the 4th dynasty into a vanished machine age. If you have ever seen the grooves people point to, the appeal is obvious. You are standing in a bare granite chamber, deep inside a pyramid built around 2600 BCE. The burial box is undecorated, almost blunt. Then, inside that hollow, where no one expects roughness, you find marks that look less like sacred craft than industrial work. But the famous controversy is already a little off-center. Its strongest version often does not rest on the coffer itself. It leans on another object Petrie found at Giza in the same 1881 to 1882 survey season, the granite drill core, later catalogued as Core 7, published in Plate 7, Number 7. A loose cylinder of stone cut by a tubular drill, separated from the block around it. In modern retellings, the core and the coffer merge into one super artifact, as if the sarcophagus itself proves a high-speed machine once screamed inside the pyramid. It does not. They are related clues. They are not the same clue. Start with what is actually there. The coffer in the king's chamber shows workmanship associated with sawing and drilling. Petrie saw 2 drill hole traces on the interior. He compared those marks with other Giza evidence and concluded the Egyptians could bore granite with tube drills. Not because he believed in lost electricity, because he was a Victorian engineer looking at repeatable marks and asking what kind of cutting action made them. The answer he moved toward was less glamorous, and in practice, more impressive. A tubular drill does not need a magical edge to defeat granite. It needs pressure, rotation, and an abrasive harder than the tool carrying it. Copper can hold shape well enough to deliver that abrasive. Quartz sand can do the grinding. The metal is not slicing the granite like a modern carbide bit. It carries the grit, keeps the path, and lets friction do patient violence to the stone. The geometry matters. Tube drills remove a ring and leave a core. Rows of such borings can open space that workers then dress and smooth. On a damaged interior surface, traces can survive where a perfect finish was never completed, or where later wear exposed older work. The coffer is an awkward witness. It is damaged. It was found empty. No confirmed burial remains of Khufu were recovered from it, and one open question never fully goes away. How much of what we see on the inside is original 4th dynasty cutting, and how much was altered by later damage, cleaning, visitors, or undocumented handling before modern recording? That gap is where the machine story finds room to grow. If the marks are partial, damaged, and hard to read, they can be made to say almost anything. A groove becomes a feed rate calculation. A striation becomes proof of extreme speed. A separate drill core becomes the coffer's secret autobiography. But the evidence is narrower than the myth. Petrie's own leap was not from granite to futuristic machinery. It was from granite to abrasive engineering. Another part often gets skipped. This stone was not local limestone lifted from the plateau. It was Aswan granite, hauled from far to the south, then shaped for one of the most restricted spaces in the monument. The achievement is not hidden in a single miraculous cut. It sits in the whole chain: quarrying, transport, layout, hollowing, finishing, emplacement. The sarcophagus looks impossible when you isolate one groove and ask what machine made it. Put that groove back inside a system that repeats, and it looks Egyptian again. So, the suspicious mark Petrie noticed in the chamber did not point to a vanished drill press. It pointed to a slower technology with a misleading surface. Officially, the claim is copper tools on hard stone, which sounds absurd. In practice, it means tube drills charged with abrasive, grinding granite, one ring at a time. In the dark, the grooves still look machine-made. Number 3. The buried ship. South of the pyramid are boat pits. That was the line on the site plan. Dry, technical, almost dismissive. But on May 26, 1954, Egyptian inspector Kamal el-Malak was clearing debris beside Khufu's Great Pyramid when the sand gave way to something far less ordinary. A row of massive limestone slabs laid so tightly over bedrock that whatever lay beneath had been sealed for roughly 4,500 years. This was not a chamber inside the monument, not a hidden corridor. It was a long, stone-lined cavity cut into the ground on the pyramid's south side, where no river could possibly have carried a vessel. If a full-sized ship was down there, it had been brought here on purpose, broken down on purpose, buried on purpose. When a small opening was made, witnesses later said a smell of ancient cedar escaped from the pit. That detail survived because no photograph can do what that moment does. You are standing in the desert heat beside the largest pyramid on Earth, and from a sealed hole in the stone comes the scent of imported wood, still alive after 45 centuries. Inside was not an intact boat waiting like a treasure chest reveal. It was stranger. The timbers had been dismantled and packed in deliberate layers, stacked across 13 levels like an enormous kit with its instructions removed. Some pieces were 23 meters long, some were barely 10 centimeters. In all, the reconstruction archive would record 651 principal parts, divided into 1,224 wooden pieces: planks, oars, deck elements, cabin parts, rope, pegs, curved ribs of cedar fitted to one another by a logic that had to be rediscovered piece by piece. A miracle object would have been easier to romanticize, a sacred craft, a lost superboat. What emerged beside Khufu's pyramid was more technical than that, and in some ways more unsettling. A vessel designed to come apart cleanly and go back together again. The man who had to prove that was not Kamal el-Malak. It was Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, the restorer who inherited a problem almost nobody would envy. Beginning in the late 1950s and working through the key reconstruction decade from 1958 to 1968, he faced a ship almost 43 to 44 meters long, but only in fragments. No modern assembly manual, no surviving Old Kingdom diagram, just hundreds of cedar components, wooden fastenings, rope lashings, and the evidence left by ancient carpenters in the joints themselves. It belongs on the list for a simple reason. It was a full-sized ship buried where no river could carry it. Mustafa studied the order in which the pieces had been stacked. He traced mortises, matching edges, rope channels, wear marks. The reconstruction was not cinematic guesswork. It was forensic woodworking. One plank told him how another had to bend. One lashing channel showed where tension had once been held. A deck beam explained the curve of a hull. The ship slowly reappeared because the Egyptians had hidden the assembly sequence inside the parts. One detail matters more than almost any other. There were no metal nails holding the hull together. Its strength came from shaped cedar planks, wooden fastenings, and rope connections that locked the vessel while still allowing flex. That is not primitive because it lacks iron. It is sophisticated because it solves a nautical problem with different assumptions. A rigid box fights the water. A flexing hull survives it. So was it ever actually used? The pit refuses to give an easy answer. The vessel is often called a solar boat, tied to royal afterlife belief and the journey of the sun god. That fits the burial beside the pyramid. But the craftsmanship is so practical, so deeply informed by real shipbuilding, that many have argued it could have sailed on the Nile as well, perhaps carrying Khufu's body or funerary equipment before burial. There was even a second dismantled boat nearby, also found in 1954 and left sealed for decades. This was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a larger ritual and technical system. The choice is not simple, not practical or symbolic, not rivercraft or cosmic vehicle. The hardest possibility is that it was both. If Mustafa's reconstruction is right, the men who built this ship knew how to make a full-scale vessel function on water. They knew how to disassemble it into hundreds of ordered components. They knew how to seal it almost airtight in stone, so cedar and rope could survive for millennia. and they knew how to place it beside a pyramid as part of a royal program that joined carpentry, ritual, logistics, and documentation into one act. Civilizations like that make impossible stories feel tempting. In the end, the boat beside Khufu's pyramid was not discovered floating, and it was not buried as a useless model. It was a real ship, taken apart with enough precision that another man, 4,500 years later, could put it back together board by board. At Giza, south of the pyramid, it waited in the dark. Number 2. The perfect north. The monument still knows where north is. About 3 minutes 38 seconds of arc, off true cardinal alignment. The average miss often cited for the Great Pyramid. Not 3 degrees, not even 1. 3 minutes and 38 seconds. A sliver of sky. On paper, that sounds tiny. On a base about 230.4 meters on a side, spread across roughly 5.3 hectares of desert stone, tiny stops being abstract. A small angular mistake at the start becomes displacement at the corners, tension in the chords, arguments in the stake line, and trouble that does not stay politely at the edge. Around the mid-26th century BCE, before Khufu's first limestone courses could rise, his surveyors had to do something brutally simple and brutally hard. They had to find true north, not the wandering pull of magnetic north. Then they had to turn that direction into a square large enough to anchor one of the biggest monuments on Earth. If that baseline drifted, the whole job drifted with it. Casing lines, corner closure, course alignment, labor pacing, even the confidence that opposite sides would meet the plan instead of exposing the mistake later, when correction was expensive and public. Start with the error, because the error is the clue. If the pyramid were merely close enough, mystery merchants could pour anything into the gap: hidden devices, lost machines, visitors from elsewhere. But the surviving casing lines say something more demanding. They miss true north by a tiny amount, and the miss is not random. It has shape. It leans slightly counterclockwise. Surveyors read mistakes the way detectives read footprints. A repeated mistake is not noise. It is procedure, fossilized in stone. That matters because one bad method would not just point the pyramid slightly wrong. It would corrupt the square itself. Stretch a line this far, and every practical weakness shows up. Sag in chord, shifting stakes, uneven ground, crews copying the wrong reference, corners that refuse to close cleanly. The real puzzle is not, how did they know north? It is, what method could survive contact with a monument this large? That is where the modern measurements become more than a list of names. Between 1880 and 1882, Flinders Petrie arrived with a theodolite and measured carefully enough to force a change in tone. The pyramid was not vaguely impressive. It was exact in a way that reduced the room for fantasy. A century later, in 1984, Mark Lehner and David Goodman established survey control points across the Giza Plateau for the Giza Plateau Mapping Project, giving later work a firmer frame. Then, in 2015, Glenn Dash and Joel Paulson went back to the surviving casing line evidence and tightened the numbers again. The west side measured about 230.378 meters. The east, about 230.391, a difference of just over a centimeter. That is not trivia. It means that over a 230-meter run, the builders were keeping a plan coherent enough that tiny mismatches remained tiny instead of cascading into obvious failure. Seen that way, the old line that the pyramid is too perfect to explain starts to fail. Perfect things are hard to reverse engineer. Imperfect things talk. Several 4th Dynasty pyramids show small directional deviations that researchers can compare. Those mismatches force us to notice something important. The builders were not chasing mystical perfection. They were using a repeatable process good enough to scale. If one monument drifts a little clockwise and another a little counterclockwise, and the pattern tracks the sky in a consistent way, then we are not looking at magic. We are looking at a workflow being executed under real field conditions. So what would that workflow look like on the plateau? One family of answers points upward, to circumpolar stars. Imagine the survey team working before dawn, when the northern sky is stable enough to use and the horizon is not blazing with daylight. Stakes are ready. A sighting tool or plumb line is set. The crew waits for a particular stellar relationship, then commits that direction to the ground before the sky moves on. That kind of method helps explain why the orientation could be so good without requiring exotic instruments. In 2000, Kate Spence proposed in Nature that a simultaneous transit of two stars could indicate true north, and that the resulting offsets might even date the orientation event. The appeal is obvious. The sky gives a precise reference. The problem is operational. It depends on timing, visibility, trained observers, and a clean handoff from momentary observation to permanent layout. A brilliant celestial fix is useless if the line cannot be transferred reliably across 13 acres of foundation. Another answer points to the sun. In 2017, Glenn Dash argued that a simple equinox shadow method could produce the same kind of small, systematic counterclockwise error seen at Giza. Here, the scene changes. No dramatic star transit, a vertical rod. A leveled surface, repeated marks, patience. You watch the shadow, plot its motion, derive an east-west line near the equinox, and construct north-south from that. The equipment is plain, but the practical question grows harsher. Can such a method produce a baseline stable enough that multiple crews can extend it, square it, and keep it alive through days of marking, checking, and building? The shadow method explains the direction of the error. It still has to survive the bureaucracy of stone. Imagine standing on the plateau before dawn. No casing stones yet, no polished apex, just stakes, cords, dust, and a sky turning cold blue over the desert. You are not building upward first. You are building sideways, into geometry. Every later block depends on these first decisions being right. Miss here by a little, and the error walks the perimeter, strains the diagonals, and waits for higher courses to expose what the ground crew thought they had hidden. So the alignment is real, that part is settled. The sharper question is not which idea sounds elegant in retrospect, but which procedure could be repeated across crews, transferred into stakes and cord, checked at monument scale, and preserved long enough to keep the square honest. The precision survived, the protocol did not. And that missing link is the danger in the story. Not that the Egyptians found north once, but that they seem to have done it as administration, as routine, across monuments. We can see the result. We can infer pieces of the sky work. What we still do not have is the chain of command on the ground, the exact field sequence that let an observation become a reproducible baseline before thousands of tons of stone made any small mistake permanent. Number 1. The Pyramid Machine. On Khufu's plateau, the lines were already true. The sides were already answering north with a steadiness that outlived empires. But a survey line does not lift stone. A perfect base does not feed men. If no hidden alien device ever appeared in the sand, what was the actual machine? In Khufu's 26th regnal year, an inspector named Merer sat down and wrote about limestone. Not spells, not secret power. Limestone. His diary, discovered in 2013 in storage galleries at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea, reads like paperwork from the edge of a mega-project. Half-day entries, named places, travel times, a crew of about 200 men, loads taken from the Tura quarries, moved by boat through the Nile system, delivered to Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, the great pyramid site at Giza. Merer is not repeating a legend written centuries later. He is inside the job. He is recording the movement of fine white casing stone while the monument is still alive with labor. The most famous pyramid on Earth enters the record through shipping notes. Those notes sharpen once you stand at Giza itself. South of the pyramids, archaeologists including Mark Lehner mapped quarry zones where much of the local limestone could be cut almost in place. Nearby, at Height El Ghurab, they uncovered a workers' settlement with barracks, bakeries, and the debris of planned provisioning. The monument was not supplied by one magical source. The core came out of the plateau around it. The finer Tura limestone came in by water for the outer skin. The site consumed deliveries. Now widen the frame. More than 2 million blocks, less than 30 years by common construction estimates. Average that across the build and the rate becomes almost absurd. Roughly one block placed every 3 minutes, hour after hour, season after season, year after year. The force of those numbers is not shock by itself. They point to a system with almost no slack. Quarry here, load there, float stone across water, unload, drag on sledges, feed crews, house crews, replace crews, keep accounts, keep authority, keep the whole chain moving. The number belongs here, not carved on a list, not announced like a prize. The Great Pyramid was the machine with no engine, no wheels, and millions of moving parts. Enter the site at ground level. A block slides in on a sledge. Men lean into rope. Another crew is already clearing the path. Bakers fire bread in bulk. Officials count rations. Quarrymen open the next cut in the limestone south of the pyramid. On the river, another load of Tura stone is already on its way. This is not one invention. It is a coordinated sequence where delay in one place becomes hunger somewhere else, and idle hands somewhere else again. Mirror matters because his papyrus does not explain the entire pyramid. It does something more valuable. It pins part of the process to a real date, a real official, and a real route. It shows that under Khufu, state supervision reached from quarry to boat to building site. The glamorous mystery is missing, but the bureaucracy is right there in ink. One piece still refuses to sit quietly: the lifting system. Ramps almost certainly mattered, but their exact form remains unsettled. A straight external ramp, zigzagging segments, spiral approaches, some hybrid arrangement we no longer have. No complete ramp survives wrapped around the Great Pyramid to settle the argument, so the vertical problem remains open. But the foundation under that debate is no longer vague. We know stone was quarried on site. We know premium casing stone came from Tura. We know laborers lived in organized installations. We know food was produced at scale. We know administrative hands were tracking movement. We know the monument was fed. With those pieces in place, the old image starts to fail. Not a vanished ray, not a lost reactor, a state project, measured in deliveries, labor rotations, quarry scars, bread, rope, sledges, river traffic, and command. The impossible look of the pyramid came from something more unsettling than a super device. It came from repeatable control. So when people ask what built the Great Pyramid, the quiet answer is the hardest one to dramatize and the hardest one to escape. The machine was never hidden inside the monument. The machine was the kingdom around it. Measurement, labor organization, stone tools, astronomy, documentation, and state power converging on one rising mass of limestone until a mountain took geometric form. At dusk, the white casing stones are gone. The harbor channels are silted. The barracks are broken low to the ground. Mirror's ink has faded to fragments. But the pyramid is still there, holding its lines against the dark, as if one enormous machine has just paused between shifts.